We are continuing our series in the Gospel of Luke, and we are coming near to the close. This morning we are going to finish chapter 22 and get into chapter 23, where we focus primarily on the trials of Jesus. So if you will, open your Bibles to chapter 22, and we're going to start reading in verse 63 this morning. Before we begin talking about this, of course, I'll remind us again of the general outline of all of this, where we're going with the story of Jesus, how Luke details his arrest, his trials, his execution, and ultimately his resurrection. But one other piece of background information I think we need to be aware of as we read this is that Jesus actually goes through 6 trials throughout the Gospels together. 3 of them are before Jewish authorities, and 3 of them are before quote-unquote Roman authorities, and I include Herod in that Roman authority, even though he was partly Jewish in his ethnicity. What we need to realize is that not all of the Gospels record this. For instance, only the Gospel of John mentions a trial before the high priest Annas. Annas was the real high priest at the time. Although the Romans did not recognize him, they installed their puppet Caiaphas into that position. But Annas was still technically the one who had that right by birth. And Luke mentions earlier in his Gospel, in Luke chapter 3, that it was both the high priesthood of both Annas and Caiaphas at that time, in Luke chapter 3 and verse 2. Most of the Gospels mention a trial before Caiaphas and really kind of an ad hoc Sanhedrin. What happened was they brought Jesus to Caiaphas, the ruling high priest, in the middle of the night, and they woke up as many of the Sanhedrin members as they could to get him out of bed to come to this council meeting, and they condemned Jesus to death on that occasion. Luke records something else, a morning trial before the Sanhedrin, in which Jesus is officially condemned to death, and that's what's going on in that particular passage. As far as the Roman trials, all of the Gospels mention that Jesus went before the Roman governor Pilate, but only Luke tells us that that trial was interrupted by a hearing before the Tetrarch Herod. There's actually several people named Herod in the Bible. There's, of course, Herod the Great, who is frequently associated with trying to kill Jesus when he was a baby. And after Herod the Great died, his dominion was kind of parceled up between 4 of his sons. Hence the expression tetrarch, which means a 4th ruler. And in this case, Herod Antipas became the ruler of Galilee. There was also Herod Archelaus, who did not last long in the southern Judean region. And there was a Herod Philip in Perea, who isn't very important to the Bible story except to have his brother steal his wife from him. And John the Baptist get all upset about that in Mark chapter 6 and Matthew chapter 14. But all of this is to say, of course, Luke actually records 4 of these trials. 2 of them are completely unique to Luke. There's the morning trial before the Sanhedrin, and there's the trial before Herod. Those are unique to Luke. And then there's also this matter of going before Pilate. Now, of course, the fact that none of the 4 Gospels records all of these trials of Jesus, I don't think ought to discombobulate us. That's just the way it is. The Gospels choose to report different things. John, for instance, never mentions a trial before Caiaphas in detail, but he does mention that at some point Jesus went before Caiaphas. He just doesn't record the trial in detail. For whatever reason, he chooses not to do that. So it's not like these gospel writers are unaware of all of the events, but rather they are presenting them in such a way as to tell the story of Jesus in their unique fashion. In Luke chapter 22, the end of the chapter is devoted to this Sanhedrin trial. I want to begin reading in verse 63. It says that the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him. And they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, "Prophesy, who is the one who hit you?" And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming. When it was day, the council of elders of the people assembled, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber, saying, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "Yes, I am." And they said, "What further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth." Well, what's going on here at this Sanhedrin trial of Jesus? Well, first thing I would note in verses 63 through 65 is that we have a beating going on before Jesus has even received a verdict. The people holding Jesus are beating him in spite of the fact that the Jewish law prohibited this kind of behavior until the judges had decreed exactly how many beatings he was supposed to receive. In Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verses 1 through 3, they have a criminal procedure that they had to follow. That procedure states that if there is a dispute between men and they go to court and the judges decide their case and they justify the righteous and condemn the wicked, then it shall be, if the wicked man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall make him lie down and be beaten in his presence with the number of stripes according to his guilt. You may beat him only 40 times but no more, so that he does not beat him with many more stripes than these, and your brother is not degraded in your eyes. Now, you see several things about that passage. You see that it's specified how many, the judge had to specify exactly how many times he was to be beaten. It wasn't supposed to be some kind of wild, unorganized flogging. And additionally, it was not to be done until the verdict had been passed. Well, apparently with Jesus, we're going to disregard procedure a little bit. In fact, what we're seeing here is they are blaspheming against Jesus. They're saying, prophesy, who is the one who hit you? Since you are Christ, since you are the prophet, if we hit you in the face while you're blindfolded, you should be able to tell us who it is. They're mocking him. They're making a mockery of him. Luke alone says that they were blaspheming when they did this. And then they have the trial in verse 66, which it says took place when it was day. Well, so many of the other trials in the Gospels took place by night. And this day trial is merely a formality. Matthew and Mark record a trial before Caiaphas, although Mark ambiguously refers to him as the high priest. But all those high priestly trials took place at night. This trial takes place when it was day. And the reason why is because, well, according to Jewish court procedures, it was illegal for the Sanhedrin to meet in the middle of the night. They weren't allowed to do that. According to their customs, the Sanhedrin was only supposed to be convening in the daytime. So, we had these hearings before Caiaphas and Annas, but, well, oh right, those weren't legal. We need to have a real trial to make this legal. And so what they do is they have a trial in which they pretty much duplicate everything all over again just so they can make Jesus' condemnation legal. Matthew and Mark don't even record the formality because of how ridiculous this whole process is. And Jesus points out the problem. The problem is that the trial is making a mockery of due process. Jesus says, if I tell you, you're not going to believe. If I ask you a question, you're not going to answer. You're not going to listen to anything I have to say on this matter because your minds are already made up. This whole thing is just a sham. The whole trial is ridiculous. And, the other Gospels record that there's so many false witnesses they get up, but they can't agree on each other's testimony. And even the thing that they finally come forward with an actual charge against him with, they can't even get consistent that he said he was going to tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. But you know what's going to happen? Jesus has to provide the testimony himself in order to make this whole thing legal. They won't believe any testimony he gives. They won't answer any question he asks. Their entire investigative procedure is faulty to the core. But, verse 69, he gives them this veiled warning of judgment. He says that from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And here he's actually alluding to 2 Old Testament passages. Psalm 110, verse 1, where it says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. And Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, which, with reference to the establishment of the kingdom, says, as I was looking in the visions, that's not Daniel 7. It says, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. But Consequently, of course, their kingdom will be destroyed and will be taken away from them. Jesus is claiming and implicitly claiming to be this Son of Man figure who sits at God's right hand to extend his scepter on the day of judgment and wrath against those who would dare conspire against the Lord's Christ. And in verse 70, they ask him a question, well, are you the Christ? Are you the Son of God? And Jesus confesses that he is. One of the few times in the Gospels we actually have Jesus admitting to being the Son of God. A lot of the times it's the demons that say it. They say he's the Son of God, and Jesus is going, shh, don't tell anybody that. He tries to quiet them, he tries to hush them up. Jesus won't admit to being the Son of God anywhere until it gets him a guilty verdict which would condemn him to death. Interesting. The only time Jesus admits to being the Son of God in the Gospels is the only time when it will get him killed. And the people in verse 71 say, well, that's blasphemy. You've heard it all yourselves. They condemn him to death on that occasion. In Leviticus 24 and verse 16, it's clear that the crime of blasphemy carries a death penalty with it. And if Jesus was not the Son of God, if he was in fact just a mere man, then this would be blasphemy. Of course, the reader knows something that the Sanhedrin does not, which is that Jesus' statement is actually true, and therefore cannot be blasphemy by definition. The people say we have no further need of testimony, we have no further need for witnesses because we've heard the words from his own mouth. Now typically in the law of Moses, in the capital case, 2 or 3 witnesses were required in order to give a death penalty. In Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 6, and Deuteronomy 19 and verse 15, you can't put someone to death unless you have 2 or 3 witnesses to the crime. But confessing to a crime, of course, eliminated the need for eyewitnesses because, you can be a witness against yourself. 2 Samuel 1:16, for instance, records a case where an Amalekite comes to David and tells him about this story of how he killed Saul. And there's a very good chance that the Amalekite was lying when he told that story. But David doesn't even bother holding a court procedure. He orders him cut down. And the reason why is because your own mouth has testified against you that you killed the Lord's anointed. 2 Samuel 1 in verse 16. So confessing to a crime makes everybody present witness and eliminates the need for eyewitness testimony. Of course, like I said before, Jesus isn't really guilty of any crime because his blasphemy is not blasphemy, it's truth. But further ironic is that in verse 65, if you remember, they were striking Christ, they were saying, prophesy who is the one you hit you, and they said that they were blaspheming. They are committing the very charge that they have brought against Jesus. But it is not the people who are holding him that are condemned for blasphemy. It is Jesus who is condemned for blasphemy. The one who spoke the only person in that assembly who spoke the truth is the one who is condemned. And he is condemned for a crime that other people are committing. Just another way in which Jesus is condemned for the crimes that all commit, in which he is in fact being punished for the sins of the world. Well, we go on to Pilate's trial, number 1. In chapter 23, the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. So Pilate asked him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, it is as you say. And Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. But they kept on insisting, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching them all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. And when Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time. Now, first of all, why is this trial before Pilate necessary? The Jews have already condemned him to death. The reason why is because the Roman government at that time had the exclusive rights over the death penalty. Under the Jewish law, the penalty for blasphemy was death, and the customary way to kill someone in the law was by stoning. But the Jews were not permitted to exercise this right of capital punishment because the Roman government had the right of the sword. The Roman government had what was known as imperium, the right to exact capital punishment. In John chapter 18, in verses 30 and 31, makes this much more emphatic when Pilate tells them, "Oh, well, take him and judge him according to your own law." At which point they respond, that your law does not permit us to put anyone to death. And since they were not permitted by the Roman government to put anyone to death, even if their law would have judged them worthy of such, they have to go to the Roman government. Of course, the Jewish people do flout that convention on occasion. For example, in Acts chapter 7, they stoned Stephen in spite of the fact that they don't have any Roman consent to that particular act. History tells us they also stoned James, the brother of Jesus, at the high priest's instigation. The Roman government did not put their stamp of approval on that either, I suppose. But in this occasion, they decide to do at least this element of due process. Jesus is brought before Pilate, and the mob gives their charges. But you notice something about the charges they give? They change the charges that they put against Jesus in verse 2. They didn't go to Pilate and say, "Pilate, he blasphemed. He claimed to be the Son of God." Well, Pilate's not going to care about that. He's not a Jew. Their blasphemy doesn't make any difference to him. So they change the charge from blasphemy to sedition. They say, "Oh, this one's a rabble-rouser. He's trying to overthrow your government. He's telling people that you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar." Which, if you remember, wasn't even true, because Jesus, in chapter 20, just several chapters ago, Jesus said the exact opposite of that. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. So they're having to make stuff up to get Jesus condemned. Not only that, he's claiming to be a Christ. He's claiming to be a king. We can't have any king but Caesar. Well, Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Yeah." Christ confesses to be a king. And, we don't have the whole conversation here. Much more of it is detailed in John chapter 18. But evidently, what Jesus said, "Yeah, I'm a king," and doesn't try to withhold that information. But after much questioning, Pilate comes back with a verdict, and the verdict is not guilty. So, if the judge renders not guilty, that means we all get to go home and everything is good, right? Well, no. The people keep insisting that he's still an insurrectionist, so let's pass the buck to Herod instead. Let's get out of... oh, he's from Galilee! Well, that's Herod's jurisdiction. He can take care of this problem. I don't want to deal with this. Pilate just kind of passes the buck in spite of the fact that he has already rendered a verdict. He sends Jesus to Herod, since Herod is in charge of the Galilean region. He is a puppet king who was granted control of that area. So, even though the verdict was not guilty, we got to go to trial by Herod. In verses 8 through 12, Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. When the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently, and Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Herod and Pilate became friends that day with one another, that very day. For before they had been enemies with each other. So what's going on here? Well, first of all, remind ourselves who Herod is. Herod is a wicked king. He's not a friend to Jesus at all. He's the one that killed John the Baptist, the forerunner of Jesus. And, Luke chapter 3 mentions the fact that Herod, he had performed many wicked acts. John rebuked him for it, and Herod added this to them all. He locked John up in prison. Luke chapter 9 and verse 7, we learn just in passing that Herod had John the Baptist killed. Other Gospels include the detail that this was at the instigation of his brother's wife, Herodias. In chapter 13 and verse 31, there's a rumor circulating that Herod wants to kill Jesus. We don't know if that rumor is true or not at the time. But in Luke chapter 9, we learn something else, that there were all sorts of rumors circulating around about Jesus, one of which is the claim that he is in fact John, risen from the dead. And there are many signs being performed as a result of Jesus' work. And so you know what Herod wants more than anything right now? He wants to see Jesus. Why does he want to see Jesus? Well, we get to chapter 23 and we learn the reason. He has wanted to see Jesus for a very long time. He's very glad to have him now because he wants to see a sign performed. Well, he's been waiting for this chance since the Galilean ministry. Herod didn't meet Jesus in Galilee, where they were both from. He meets Jesus in Jerusalem. He wants Jesus to be his kind of performing artist, which, you remember what Jesus said about people who ask for signs in chapter 11, you'll know where this is going. Jesus isn't going to perform. He refuses to answer any questions. He refuses to address any of the accusations that are being made. He is silent even in response to their mocking. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, he is not opening his mouth before Herod. And of course, this is fulfilling a prediction that Jesus made earlier in chapter 18 in verses 31 and 32, where he told his disciples, he took the 12 aside, and he said to them, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and all things which are written through the prophets about the Son of Man will be accomplished. For he will be handed over to the Gentiles, he will be mocked and mistreated and spit upon, and after they have scourged him, they will kill him. The third day he will rise again." Well, here he is, handed over to the Gentiles, handed over to this puppet king of the Romans. And he's being mocked, and he's being mistreated, and he's being spit upon in fulfillment of his prediction. He will be handed over to the Gentiles, mocked, and he will be mistreated. He will be scourged. He will be despised and rejected. He will be the man of sorrows, who is acquainted with grief. He is, in verse 11, mocked in a royal robe. Why do they dress him in a royal robe? Well, Jesus claims to be king, so hey, let's dress him up like a king. You know, this is coming from Herod, the puppet king, you know, the guy who's not even a real king, he's just kind of a fake king that the Romans have set up. But hey, this is my chance to make fun of Jesus, another king, by making him into a mockery of a king. And after all of this mocking that takes place in this royal robe, he sends Jesus back to Pilate. He passes the buck himself. Now, notice how these two leaders, these two great people who are supposed to decide justice for the nation, keep passing the buck back and forth. They can't render a verdict. Well, they can render a verdict, but they keep passing it on to someone else even after the verdict is rendered. Even though neither man finds guilt in Jesus, the accusers won't quit their furious cascade of accusations, and the judges persist in punishing Jesus without a crime. If Jesus is truly not guilty, why mock him in this fashion? Why mistreat him before these people in this way? But Jesus' death does something else here. All of this event serves to unite two political enemies, Herod and Pilate. They don't like each other very much, but they become friends from that day onward. Why? Well, some people think this is an example of, two people who weren't friends being brought together, and it foreshadows the real reconciliation that we have in Jesus. And some people, might say, well, this is just a historical detail about public relations that would have been known to people. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. There might even be truth to the first claim. It says something about Luke's historicity when he includes details that would have been known to the people of that day. It's kind of trying to remind you that this is grounded in current events. This is not something that is just fanciful fabrication, off-the-wall production. Now, the Gospels never present themselves as fictional material. There's a lot of skeptics out there that are trying to argue that, but it's an unsustainable case. The Gospels never present themselves as mythic material. They are presenting themselves as history that is grounded in fact, is grounded in real events of the day. That's why Luke, more than anybody else, take pains to tell you who the governors were, who the kings were, who the priests were, all the stuff that was going on at that time, and why he even brings up something like this about that was the day that Pilate and Herod became friends. So that's a big shift in public relations. That's like you finding out that your governor candidate has switched parties for the third time or something like that. It's something that everybody would have been aware of. But there's also another thing going on here, and what this is it's a fulfillment of the Psalm 2, where the nations are conspiring and plotting against Jesus. And the reason we know it's a fulfillment of that is because the New Testament later tells us that very thing in Acts chapter 4. In Acts chapter 4, in verses 27 and 28, I'm going to back up further, actually. The apostles come out from being attacked by the Sanhedrin and accused by them. And when they had been released, they went to their own companions and reported all that the chief priests and the elders had said to them. When they heard this, they lifted their voices to God with one accord and said, O Lord, it is you who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, who by the Holy Spirit, through the mouth of our father David, your servant, said, Why did the Gentiles rage and the peoples devise futile things? The kings of the earth took their stand, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. What's going on here? These men have differed on every controversy, who fought against each other at every turn, finally find something they can agree on. What we're going to do with Jesus, this passing the buck. Let me tell you something. These men are friends, but they are not friends to Jesus. Don't be fooled by the fact that they keep issuing verdicts of not guilty. They are not, neither Pilate nor Herod is a friend to Jesus in any way. Because they both punish him. They both mock him. They both facilitate his mocking, in spite of having no crime with which to condemn him. They both pass the buck on giving him justice. They follow the masses in doing evil. Though they know what is right, they choose what the crowd says, and thereby pervert justice. Exodus 23 and verse 2 says, You shall not follow the masses in doing evil. There's a mob that's proclaiming, Crucify, crucify. It doesn't matter what the crowd says. We are not justified for following something simply because everybody else is doing it. That was not true in the death of Jesus either. These men are friends, but not to Jesus. Well, we come back to Pilate. And verse 13 through 25, Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and he said to them, You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion, and behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore I will punish him and release him. I'll stop there for a second. This is what Herod's verdict is. He is not guilty. And because he is not guilty, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to punish him. Does that make sense to you? That doesn't make sense to me. How many people do you know who get a verdict of not guilty and, but we're still going to, your penalty is this? That doesn't happen. Not guilty means not guilty. It means we're supposed to let you go. We're not supposed to have a punishment for somebody who's not guilty. Herod found him not guilty. Even though Herod was one of the ones mocking him and behaving pretty much like he does in all of the Gospels, as weak-willed and caving to whatever the people around him say. Why punish a man if the verdict is not guilty? Well, because this is Pilate caving to the masses and doing evil, caving to the mob mentality. You pick up in verse 18, they all cried out together, saying, Away with this man, and release for us Barabbas. Now, he was one who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection made in the city, and for murderer. In other words, people demand a real insurrectionist. They just brought Jesus in and say, This man, he's stirring up the people. We want you to execute him. And we want you to free this guy over here. The real insurrectionist. The guy who really stirs up these people. Verse 17 is omitted in a lot of textual variants, but it's including a detail that explains what's going on here. That Pilate was obliged to release them at the feast, one prisoner. That's what's going on in all of the Gospels is, at the feast they had a custom. We would release one prisoner, just kind of a show of good faith. And in this case, we want this man to be released. Pilate tries to release Jesus, but they want Barabbas instead. In verse 18 it says they demand that Barabbas be released and Jesus be killed. Well, verse 20, Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again. But they kept calling out, saying, Crucify, crucify him. And he said to them the third time, Why? What evil has this man done? I have found in him no guilt, demanding death. Therefore I will punish him and release him. But they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified. And their voices began to prevail. And Pilate pronounced sentenced that their demand be granted. And he released the man they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder. But he delivered Jesus to their will. Pilate is overwhelmed. He pronounces the verdict, not guilty, but the penalty is still death. For the third time, 3 times in this story, Jesus is declared not guilty. In verse 4, in verses 14 and 15, and in verse 22. But even when Pilate pronounces him not guilty for the 3rd time, he still says, I will punish him and release him. He's not following justice here. Is he trying to secure justice for Jesus? Did Pilate one of those people that just wanted to do the right thing but was too weak-willed to do it? Pilate gives the people what they want. The people who shout the loudest win the argument. Has it really changed that much today? The people who make the most noise, the people who make the most fuss are usually the ones that get their way. One of my children did that. They just all decide they're going to shout at me louder and louder until they get their way on something. Well, if I'm a decent father, I wouldn't cave to their will, would I? I would say, no, you're not getting that. That's not yours to get. But Pilate, he caves. He releases a real insurrectionist to kill one not guilty of insurrection. And so once again, we see that Jesus is condemned for a crime that somebody else committed. And this is the most twisted court verdict ever. Jesus is found not guilty. He is sentenced to death anyways. You know what is ridiculous about this whole thing? Is that Jesus could have gotten out of it any time he wanted to. He could have summoned an army of angels. He could have just slipped away from them like he did before. He could have just not been caught. He knew who the betrayer was who was singling him out, the scribes and the chief priests. He could have said words in his defense which would have refuted all of the charges against him. Jesus is very good at refuting people, if you've seen that throughout the Gospels. Jesus doesn't do those things. He allows this mockery of a trial to take place. He allows this absolute upheaval of all that is just and right to take place. He allows these people whom He made, whom He created, whom they would not have the voices to shout, crucify, were it not for Him. He allows them to condemn Him to death in the most shameful and horrifying manner possible. How many of us could do that? How many of us would stand on trial for crimes that we did not commit and say nothing in our defense? How many of us could stand trial while people heaped lie upon lie against us and not say anything in response? Not say a word of insult, not revile in return, because there's something bigger going on. I don't have that kind of willpower. I'm far too forceful and argumentative of a person in personality to really not try to say a word or two in my defense. But Jesus, He does this on behalf of somebody else. He takes the punishment for crimes that He did not commit, the crimes that others did commit. He takes the punishment for crimes that you and I commit because of His great love with which He loved us. As Romans 5 says, while we were still helpless, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. One will hardly die for a righteous man. Perhaps for the good man, someone would dare even to die. But God demonstrates His own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by His blood, we shall be saved from the wrath of God through Him. If while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of His Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by His life. Why is it that Jesus came into this world? Why, as they're saying this morning, why did the Savior leave heaven to come to the earth below? To a place where men would not receive His grace. And why is it? We're at a time of year when many people want to commemorate the birth of Jesus. Why He came into this world. Well, why did He come into this world? Because He loved us. Because He was going to the cross. Because that was the plan from day one. That was the plan from before the foundation of the world. And it was because of His great love with which He loved us. How He loved me so. You would take out your songbooks. Every time I read the gospel story, the story of Jesus, His arrest, His betrayal, His trials, His crucifixion, I am reminded of my own unworthiness. And I am reminded of the wonders of His glorious love. I am reminded of the fact that I don't really have an argument to make. I don't really have a plea to make before the God of heaven. I don't really have a complaint that I am justified in making. I don't really have the right to go around saying, people don't treat me fairly. Well, guess what? If I say that, I'm confronted with the cross. The place where Jesus was treated most unfairly of all of us. The place where Jesus willingly endured the pain, the suffering, and the shame of something He did not deserve. Was there ever grief like His? Was there ever undeserved suffering like His? Was there ever someone who did not get what He deserved like Jesus? And were there ever people like us who did not receive the punishment they deserved because of Jesus? May God help us to see more clearly the love that God has for His people. If you're here this morning and your relationship with the Lord is not right, and you have been convicted by the death of Jesus, by the atrocities that were committed against Him, and you have been moved by the love that He demonstrated on the cross, and how more deeply we learn things about it every day and every week. There's something you need to do to make your life right with the Lord. By being immersed into His death, by being conformed to His death. Now is the time to make it known. Now is the appropriate time to make known your needs before this congregation. Won't you do that? All together we stand and we sing.